Welcome back. This channel exists for one reason: to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when the destination is uncomfortable. For years, the Sussex saga has been parsed frame by frame. Analysts have tracked body language, money trails, staff turnover, and the choreography of modern public relations. Yet today marks a pivot. Every rumor, every dismissed whisper, every theory shelved as impossible converges here. What follows is not presented as gossip, but as an allegation backed by documents now circulating among legal representatives, and it threatens to detonate a narrative built with extraordinary care. For a decade, observers have noted a blank space in the public timeline, a stretch of years treated as administrative footnotes, a silence louder than explanation. A name occasionally surfaced, then vanished again, scrubbed from searches and ignored by major outlets. Joe Guiliano. To some, he was a college acquaintance. To others, a fleeting early relationship. Nothing more. Institutions declined comment. Editors looked away. But secrets do not disappear. They age, they harden, and they eventually resurface. Today, that resurfacing has a face and a voice. A 29-year-old woman, identified as Sarah, has come forward with claims she says are supported by admissible DNA results and sworn statements. Her assertion is stark: that she is the biological daughter of Meghan Markle and Joe Guiliano, born long before fame, royalty, and global scrutiny. If accurate, this would reframe decades of storytelling and raise questions no public relations strategy can outrun: that we are not asking you to suspend critical thinking. In fact, we insist on the opposite. Dates matter. Math matters. Paper trails matter. This story stands or falls on verifiable facts, not outrage. So we begin where any serious examination must begin: the timeline. Because before emotion, before judgment, before denial, the numbers have to add up. Stay with us as we lay out what is claimed, what is documented, and what remains disputed, step by step, letting evidence, not allegiance, decide what comes next and why this moment demands attention, scrutiny, and restraint. Now, Sarah is 29 years old. That number anchors every allegation that follows. Placed on a calendar, it lands squarely in the mid-1990s, years before television contracts, before royal protocols, before global attention. Public biographies summarize a period as unremarkable, focus on school, ambition, and preparation. Sarah disputes that summary. She argues the timeline is incomplete, marked by gaps that were never accidental. According to her account, those gaps align with concealed pregnancy and birth, a conclusion she says is supported by documentation reviewed by independent legal counsel. At the center of her claim is a DNA test described as court-admissible. The reported probability of maternity is presented as statistically decisive. Sarah emphasizes this is not memory, rumor, or interpretation. She frames it as biology and arithmetic. If accurate, the implication would fundamentally alter the public narrative, suggesting the Duchess of Sussex has a third child unacknowledged in public records. Sarah describes growing up with unanswered questions surrounding her origin. She says early inquiries were met with deflection, partial answers, or silence. As she matured, she claims physical resemblance became harder to dismiss. Recognition gradually turned into private investigation. That investigation, she alleges, led to genetic confirmation. She maintained she attempted to resolve the matter without publicity, reaching out quietly through intermediaries and formal channels. According to her, letters went unanswered, emails received no reply, and messages were returned unopened. She interprets this not as disbelief but as avoidance, a distinction she considers central. Silence, she argues, implies recognition rather than uncertainty. Another figure stands at the center of this account: Joe Guiliano. For years his name appeared briefly in online discussions before disappearing again. He was portrayed publicly as insignificant and temporary. Sarah contends that portrayal was intentional. She alleges Joe was pressured into silence through legal agreements involving families rather than direct parties. According to representatives speaking on her behalf, Joe believed remaining silent protected the child. If true, his absence reflects exclusion rather than abandonment. Sarah states Joe has now provided a sworn affidavit supporting her claims. While not yet tested publicly, its existence raises the stakes. Two aligned accounts supported by genetic evidence move the issue beyond rumor and into formal dispute. Sarah describes the emotional cost of prolonged silence. She recounts growing up without clarity, while Joe, she claims, lived knowing a child existed whom he could not acknowledge. Silence, in her telling, was not peace but erosion. The allegations inevitably collide with public image. For years, the Sussex brand has emphasized compassion, advocacy, and transparency, with motherhood central to its messaging. Sarah's emergence introduces a contradiction that cannot be resolved through public relations alone. She describes watching speeches about empathy while feeling excluded from their emotional universe, a contrast she says intensified over time. She alleges attempts to make contact before major public milestones, including the royal wedding. According to her account, none resulted in dialogue. She does not frame this as misunderstanding. She frames it as deliberate avoidance. That framing shifts the question from whether her claim was doubted to whether it was recognized and managed. Prince Harry's role remains an open question. Sarah does not claim to know whether he was aware of her existence. She poses a question without answering it. If he knew, she suggests silence implicates him. If he did not, ignorance would represent profound breach of trust. Either scenario carries consequences that extend beyond private life into public credibility. Sarah insists she is not seeking punishment or spectacle. She frames her actions as corrective, not vindictive. Her stated aim is simple recognition of truth. Dates, records, and testimony will determine what follows. She asks observers to suspend allegiance and examine facts. This first stage begins with the calendar itself. Before conclusions, the missing months must be accounted for. Numbers do not bend to narrative control. Everything that follows depends on that foundation. That foundation, Sarah argues, will either confirm her claims or dismantle them. She welcomes either outcome, insisting resolution matters more than validation. Until records are produced and timelines reconciled, she says speculation should pause. Evidence, not emotion, must lead. Only then can responsibility be assigned and consequences understood. Public scrutiny follows when private silence endures for decades long. Attention now shifts from dates to decisions. If Sarah's account is accurate, the concealment of her existence was not a single moment, but a sustained series of choices made over years. Choices made by adults, institutions, and systems designed to manage risk. According to Sarah, this is where the story becomes less about youth and more about intent. She alleges that once her birth occurred, the priority was no longer secrecy alone, but containment, not disappearance, but controlled proximity. She claimed she was raised close enough to be monitored, yet far enough to remain deniable. Such arrangements, while rare, are not without precedent in high-profile families seeking to neutralize long-term exposure. Sarah says this strategy allowed oversight without acknowledgement. Central to this phase is the role of intermediaries. Sarah alleges decisions were handled through family channels rather than direct communication. She claims arrangements were framed as protection, stability, and opportunity. Over time, she says, those justifications hardened into policy. The child became a variable to manage, not a relationship to maintain. Legal experts note that informal agreements often operate in gray areas. Sarah's representatives suggest sealed records, private understandings, and non-disclosure agreements were used to ensure silence. They emphasize these claims remain allegations, but argue the pattern fits the outcome. Silence across decades rarely sustains itself without reinforcement. Sarah describes fragmented memories from early childhood. She recalls visits from a woman she says resembled her, brief encounters marked by emotion and abrupt departures. She does not assert certainty regarding identity, but frames these recollections as unresolved impressions. Over time, absence replaced presence entirely. The psychological implications are significant. Specialists note that concealed origins can produce long-lasting identity disruption. Sarah describes feelings of displacement, hypervigilance, and persistent doubt. She says her sense of self developed alongside an unanswered question: who am I and why was I hidden? As Meghan Markle's public profile expanded, Sarah says the emotional contrast intensified. Watching a mother figure celebrated globally while remaining unacknowledged privately created what she describes as cognitive dissonance. She emphasizes this was not envy, but confusion. Public narrative spoke of compassion, while private reality remained silent. Sarah alleges she attempted renewed contact as an adult, believing maturity and time might change responses. According to her, those attempts were met with the same outcome: silence, blocked communication, returned correspondence. She frames this not as chaos, but consistency, a maintained boundary. This consistency, she argues, undermines claims of ignorance. She suggests avoidance required awareness. Institutions may ignore rumors, but they respond to documentation. Sarah's representatives claim evidence was provided and still dismissed. If accurate, this suggests a deliberate choice to preserve narrative continuity. The question then expands beyond individual responsibility. It becomes institutional. When reputations, contracts, and titles are at stake, systems prioritize stability. Sarah argues she became collateral in that prioritization. Her existence introduced risk. Managing risk meant managing her. Observers note that once reputational machinery engages, reversal becomes difficult. Admission creates cascading consequences. Silence becomes the least disruptive option. Sarah contends this logic governed decisions for decades. She emphasizes she does not seek retroactive justice. She seeks acknowledgement. She wants confirmation that decisions were made, not accidents endured. Recognition matters, she argues, because it restores agency. Without it, she remains an object of strategy rather than a subject of truth. As this phase concludes, Sarah returns to a central point. Concealment is not passive. It requires maintenance. Every year of silence is an active choice. Every unanswered letter reinforces it. She insists this pattern reveals intent. Whether that intent was protection or preservation is a question now under examination. That examination will rely not on sentiment but substantiation. Documents either exist or they do not. Records confirm actions or contradict them. Sarah says she accepts whichever outcome emerges. Her concern is resolution, not vindication. Until disclosure occurs, she argues, speculation should remain secondary. The focus must remain on evidence alone. Only then can accountability be discussed meaningfully. Public judgment follows transparency, not the other way around. For now, she maintains, the record remains incomplete. Completing it is the purpose of speaking now. What emerges will reshape narratives or reinforce them. Either result carries consequence. Silence is no longer sustainable. That era has ended permanently now. As the focus widens, the narrative inevitably collides with public image. Sarah's claims do not exist in isolation. They intersect directly with a carefully constructed identity built over many years. Public storytelling relies on coherence. When a previously unseen chapter appears, it forces a reevaluation of everything that came before it. For more than a decade, Meghan Markle's public persona has emphasized empathy, resilience, and moral clarity. Motherhood has been central to that portrayal. Sarah argues that this is why silence around her existence carries such weight. She is not simply excluded from the narrative. She contradicts it. Sarah describes watching interviews, speeches, and documentaries that emphasize compassion and family, while feeling erased from that vision. She does not describe anger as her first response. She describes disbelief. According to her, the emotional fracture widened gradually, not suddenly. Each public affirmation of values, she says, were denied privately intensified the disconnect. She alleges this disconnect explains why attempts at private resolution failed. According to her account, acknowledging her existence would have required more than a personal admission. It would have required narrative recalibration. She believes that cost was deemed too high. This brings Prince Harry into sharper focus. Sarah does not accuse him directly. She poses questions and allows implications to unfold. Did he know, and if so, when? If he did not know, Sarah argues the concealment extended into marriage, partnership, and public advocacy. If he did know, silence becomes complicity. Neither option is neutral. Analysts note that public credibility is relational. It depends not only on what is said, but what is omitted. Sarah's emergence reframes past interviews and statements, particularly those centered on truth, trauma, and protection. She suggests omission, when sustained, becomes deception. The potential impact on brand relationships is significant. Public figures trade on trust. Media contracts assume authenticity. Charitable initiatives rely on moral authority. Sarah's claims introduce uncertainty into each of those domains. Even unresolved, they destabilize confidence. Sarah insists she did not choose the timing for strategic advantage. She says timing chose her. Years of silence, she claims, became unsustainable as public narratives hardened. She reached a point where continuing to remain invisible felt like self-erasure. She frames her actions not as exposure, but as correction. She argues that truth does not destroy legitimacy. Concealment does. In her view, acknowledging complexity strengthens credibility, while denying it fractures trust. Observers note the tension between personal privacy and public accountability. Sarah does not dispute the right to privacy. She disputes the right to secrecy when it involves another person's existence. She draws a distinction between protecting a child and erasing one. The reaction from mainstream media has been muted. Some interpret this as caution, others see avoidance. Sarah suggests it reflects legal anxiety rather than editorial skepticism. She claims her representatives have invited scrutiny and verification, not dismissal. This silence mirrors earlier patterns. She argues institutions delay response until response becomes unavoidable. That delay, she says, is strategic. It buys time. But time also allows questions to multiply. As scrutiny grows, Sarah emphasizes restraint. She asks observers to resist emotional conclusions and focus instead on documentation. Her representatives maintain that additional records will be released methodically, not theatrically. The goal, they say, is clarity, not spectacle. The emotional core, however, remains unchanged. Sarah says she wants acknowledgement before anything else. Not reconciliation, not compensation, but recognition. She frames this as a prerequisite for any further conversation. She also emphasizes that her siblings are not abstract figures to her. They are people she believes have a right to know she exists. She describes this not as intrusion, but as kinship denied. As this phase closes, the story reaches a threshold. Public narratives can absorb many challenges, but identity claims rooted in biology demand resolution. They cannot be indefinitely postponed. Sarah insists this is why she spoke when she did, not to provoke collapse, but to end erasure. What follows will depend on evidence, response, and transparency. Silence has carried the story this far. It cannot carry it further. The next phase will test whether acknowledgement replaces avoidance, or whether containment remains a preferred strategy. Either path carries consequences. That choice is no longer Sarah's alone. It now belongs to everyone implicated by the record. The narrative has shifted irreversibly forward. As attention intensifies, the focus turns toward institutions and power structures that operate beyond individual choice. Sarah's claims, if accurate, would not have survived in isolation. Long-term silence requires reinforcement. It requires systems capable of absorbing risk and neutralizing exposure. According to Sarah, that reinforcement came not from a single decision, but from layered containment. She argues that once concealment became policy, every subsequent milestone raised the stakes. Education, career advancement, and public recognition all increased the cost of acknowledgement. What may have begun as a private decision hardened into an institutional one. The longer silence endured, the more destabilizing truth became. Observers point to royal vetting processes as a critical junction. These systems are designed to surface vulnerabilities before they become liabilities. An undisclosed child would constitute a significant vulnerability. Sarah does not claim certainty regarding what was known or when. She asks a narrower question. Was the information missed, or was it managed? Both possibilities carry implications. A failure to detect suggests systemic oversight. A decision to manage suggests complicity. Sarah maintains that either scenario warrants scrutiny. Silence from official channels, she argues, does not resolve the question. It amplifies it. Speculation has also focused on reported tensions between Meghan Markle and palace staff. Public explanations reference personality conflicts and cultural adjustment. Sarah suggests an alternative interpretation. She posits that undisclosed pressure, rather than temperament, may have fueled conflict. This remains conjecture, but she argues it aligns with patterns of institutional containment. Containment strategies typically involve three elements: silence, distance, and legal insulation. Sarah alleges all three were present. She describes legal barriers preventing acknowledgement, geographic separation limiting exposure, and sustained silence reinforcing deniability. Each element alone proves nothing. Together, she argues, they form a coherent strategy. The role of family intermediaries again becomes central. Sarah claims decisions were framed as necessary sacrifices for future stability. She alleges emotional language was used to justify permanent outcomes. Protection became preservation. Preservation became erasure. Legal analysts note that non-disclosure agreements involving children are vulnerable to challenge. Courts prioritize welfare over confidentiality. Sarah's representatives have suggested this principle underpins their approach. If formal proceedings occur, discovery could compel disclosure of records assumed buried. The lack of public denial is also scrutinized. In high-profile disputes, denial is often swift when claims are unfounded. Silence, Sarah argues, reflects complexity rather than confidence. She acknowledges legal caution may explain restraint, but maintains restraint has consequences. From her perspective, institutional silence shifts burden onto the claimant. She becomes responsible for proving existence rather than the institution explaining absence. That inversion, she argues, is unjust. Sarah frames her challenge as existential rather than adversarial. She does not seek entry into institutions. She seeks recognition outside them. Titles, status, and affiliation are irrelevant to her stated aim. She wants acknowledgement of truth, not inclusion in hierarchy. As pressure builds, Sarah emphasizes patience. She states she understands the gravity of the claims and the need for careful verification. She insists her representatives are prepared to engage with any legitimate inquiry. Transparency, she argues, benefits everyone. She also addresses accusations of opportunism. She counters that opportunism seeks advantage. She seeks closure. Public attention, she says, is a byproduct, not a goal. Silence, she maintains, left her no alternative. The broader question now becomes sustainability. Can containment persist in an era of genetic verification and digital records? Sarah argues it cannot. Information no longer resides solely within institutions. It circulates, replicates, and resists erasure. As this phase concludes, the story approaches a point of no return. Institutions accustomed to controlling narratives now face claims rooted in biology. Biology does not negotiate. It confirms or it contradicts. Sarah reiterates that she accepts either outcome. If evidence disproves her claims, she says she will withdraw. If evidence supports them, she expects acknowledgement. What she rejects is indefinite suspension. The next phase will test institutional response. Acknowledgement, denial, or continued silence will each carry consequence. Sarah maintains she has already endured the cost of silence. Others now face decisions of their own. Those decisions will shape not only reputations, but credibility itself. The record will expand. The timeline will close. What remains unresolved will no longer be attributed to absence of evidence, but to choice. That distinction changes everything going forward. As the narrative advances, attention returns to the human cost at its center. Beyond institutions, contracts, and reputations, Sarah frames her story as one of identity delayed. She emphasizes that secrecy does not freeze time. Children grow. Questions compound. Silence accumulates weight. Sarah says her decision to speak publicly followed years of internal negotiation. She describes cycles of doubt, hope, and restraint. Each time she considered remaining silent, she says another public narrative hardened around values she felt excluded from. Compassion, family, honesty. Words that carried meaning for audiences, but not for her lived experience. She rejects the idea that truth must wait for convenience. According to Sarah, the timing was not chosen for maximum impact, but for personal survival. She says continuing to exist as an unacknowledged footnote became psychologically untenable. Speaking was not an escalation. It was release. The question of motive continues to surface. Critics ask whether attention, compensation, or leverage played a role. Sarah counters that leverage implies negotiation. She claims she has refused private settlements, non-disclosure agreements, and closed-door resolutions. She insists transparency is the only outcome she seeks. Anything less, she argues, replicates the original harm. Media interest has intensified. Offers for interviews, documentaries, and book deals have reportedly emerged. Sarah acknowledges this interest, but states participation would occur only without narrative control. She refuses editorial oversight that would compromise accuracy. She insists documentation will accompany testimony. Her representatives echo this stance, emphasizing verification over dramatization. The prospect of public storytelling raises further ethical questions. Who owns a story rooted in shared biology? Who controls narrative when silence has already shaped decades? Sarah argues that reclaiming narrative is not appropriation, it is restoration. She also addresses the impact on others indirectly affected. She expresses reluctance about public exposure of siblings and extended family. She frames this not as intrusion but inevitability. Secrets involving people do not remain contained. They surface eventually, often with greater force. Early acknowledgement, she argues, would have minimized harm. Sarah reiterates that reconciliation is not her demand. Recognition is. She does not ask for a role, relationship, or redemption arc. She asks for confirmation that she exists and that choices were made. Accountability, she argues, begins with naming reality. Observers note that such acknowledgement carries risk. It invites scrutiny of past decisions and present narratives. Yet it also offers closure. Without acknowledgement, stories fracture and multiply. Sarah suggests that silence breeds speculation while truth narrows it. She frames her position as patient but firm. She does not issue ultimatums. She sets conditions. Evidence will be presented. Responses will be evaluated. Silence will be interpreted accordingly. This is not confrontation, she says. It is process. As public discourse evolves, Sarah emphasizes restraint again. She discourages harassment, conjecture, and hostility. She urges observers to separate claim from conclusion. Investigation requires discipline. Emotion clouds judgment. She asks audiences to wait for records before forming opinions. She also speaks directly to the idea of legacy. She argues that legacies are not destroyed by truth. They are distorted by denial. Acknowledgement, she suggests, humanizes rather than diminishes. It allows complexity to coexist with achievement. Sarah's narrative does not ask for belief without proof. It asks for examination. She maintains confidence that documentation will withstand scrutiny. If it does not, she says she will accept that outcome publicly. What she will not accept is erasure by default. As this phase closes, the story moves closer to resolution. Public attention cannot substitute for evidence, but it can compel response. Sarah believes that threshold has been crossed. The conversation is no longer confined to speculation. It is now anchored in record. What remains unresolved is response. Acknowledgement, denial, or continued silence will define the next chapter. Sarah has taken her step. Others must now decide theirs. The balance between privacy and truth has shifted. Once shifted, it does not easily return. This moment will be remembered not for accusation alone, but for what followed it. History will note whether silence persisted or whether clarity finally emerged. That outcome will shape how this story is ultimately understood. As the final phase unfolds, attention turns toward consequence. Not speculation, not reaction, but outcome. Sarah's emergence has already altered the landscape, regardless of how the evidence is ultimately judged. Once a claim rooted in identity enters public discourse, it cannot be recontained. It must be addressed, resolved, or disproven. Silence no longer resets the narrative. It becomes part of it. Sarah acknowledges the weight of that reality. She does not frame herself as a disruptor by choice. She frames herself as a result of decisions made long before she could consent. Her position is consistent. If documentation disproves her claim, she says she will accept that conclusion publicly and withdraw. If documentation confirms it, she expects acknowledgement proportionate to the truth. Anything less, she argues, perpetuates harm. Legal observers note that the next steps will likely occur outside public commentary. Courts, filings, and sworn testimony operate on timelines independent of public attention. Sarah's representatives have indicated readiness for that process. They emphasize that genetic evidence, affidavits, and records either withstand scrutiny or collapse under it. There is no middle ground. The implications extend beyond individual accountability. This case tests how modern institutions respond when legacy narratives collide with biological claims. Reputation management evolved in an era where silence could outlast inquiry. That era is ending. DNA databases, digital archives, and decentralized media challenge containment strategies that once succeeded. Sarah's insistence on transparency reflects that shift. She does not seek to control the story. She seeks to conclude it. Control, she argues, belongs to evidence. Her role is to present what she has and submit to examination. She also addresses the emotional endpoint. Closure does not require reconciliation, she says. It requires clarity. She does not expect apologies or explanations. She expects acknowledgement of existence. Recognition, in her framing, restores agency. It allows her story to be hers, not managed by others. As discussion continues, Sarah reiterates a request for restraint. She discourages harassment, speculation about minors, and narrative excess. She emphasizes that truth emerges through process, not pressure. Public discourse should reflect that discipline. She also rejects the idea that the story must end in destruction. She argues that accountability and collapse are not synonymous. Institutions survive truth when they confront it. They fracture when they deny it. This distinction, she believes, will define the outcome. Observers note that the absence of definitive response has become conspicuous. In disputes where claims lack substance, rebuttals are swift. Prolonged silence invites interpretation. Sarah does not assign motive to that silence. She notes its effect. Unanswered claims expand. Addressed claims narrow. As the record continues to develop, the public will confront a choice: accept silence as resolution or demand documentation. Sarah believes the latter will prevail, not because of outrage, but because uncertainty is unsustainable. She closes her narrative with a final assertion: identity is not optional. Existence does not expire. Truth, delayed, does not become false. It becomes heavier. By speaking now, she says, she has released herself from that weight. What follows will be written by responses, filings, and facts. This moment marks transition, not conclusion. The story moves from allegation to assessment, from silence to scrutiny, from narrative control to evidentiary record. History will remember this period not for what was alleged, but for how it was addressed, whether acknowledgement replaced avoidance, or whether denial endured. Sarah has chosen exposure over erasure. Others must now choose response over silence. The final outcome remains unwritten, but one thing is settled. The question of existence has been raised publicly, supported by documentation, and placed into record. That question will not disappear again. The era of containment has ended. Resolution, one way or another, has begun. As we close this chapter, it is worth pausing on the gravity of what this story represents. It did not have to unfold this way. There was another path, a moment years ago when honesty could have changed everything. Imagine if, before the world was watching, the truth had been spoken plainly, not as scandal, but as humanity, a young woman, a difficult choice, and a chance for reconciliation. That story could have been met with understanding. It could have become a narrative of accountability and growth. Instead, silence was chosen. Image was protected. Reality was deferred. And deferred truths have a cost. Now the consequences are no longer theoretical. Narratives are fracturing. Alliances are straining. And a story once tightly managed is moving beyond control. This is not the end. It is the turning point. What happens next will be shaped by evidence, response, and accountability. Thank you for staying with us through this investigation. We will continue to follow every development, every filing, and every response as it unfolds. Make sure you're subscribed, and make sure you share this video. These stories persist only when they are examined. Until next time, keep asking questions, because truth does not disappear. It waits.